The woman nicknamed the Doomsday Mom, Lori Vallow, has been found guilty of murdering her 2 children. On day 2 of deliberations, the Idaho jury came back with the guilty verdicts on all counts, including 2 for the murders of Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow. She was also found guilty of conspiring to murder her new husband's then wife. Joshua Ritter, a friend of the show, is a criminal defense attorney and former LA district attorney. He joins us now live to talk more about that verdict and the case itself. Thank you so much, as always, for taking the time here to join us.
Thank you for having me.
So first off, the verdict came back fairly quickly. You're talking about less than 2 days of deliberations. Was that surprising in any way?
Yeah, to some extent it was. I mean, you're talking about 5 weeks of testimony, nearly 60 witnesses were called. That's a lot of information to digest. So for them to come back in a matter of hours, it was less than even an entire day's worth of deliberation. That is a little surprising, but it's not if you think about how convincing the case was. That even though we asked jurors to reserve their judgment until the time that they have to deliberate, they're making up their minds along the way, just like everyone else. And I think this case was just so overwhelming that by the time they actually got to the deliberation room, they had already made up their minds.
And I mean, you're talking about a 5-week-long trial, a lot of different testimony, and it sounds like the defense really didn't call any witnesses there. What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that was a bit of a surprising move. Given the magnitude of this, you would have expected them to at least call some, character type witnesses, somebody to talk about how her personality changed since she met Chad Daybell, something along those lines. But to call no one really doesn't look like they were putting their best efforts forward. And I'm not trying to call into question the integrity of the attorneys, but what I think, and this is purely speculation, is that Lori Vallow was probably controlling more of the behind the scenes and what was taking place in court than we may have realized.
Anything surprising about the verdict itself?
Not to the extent that they found her responsible or connected in some ways to the deaths, but in one small respect, I did find it surprising that they were able to arrive at a verdict on the death of Tammy Daybell so quickly, because I felt of all the prosecution's evidence, that was probably the most attenuated to show that Lori was somehow connected to Tammy Daybell's death or was aware of it or participated in it. But I think that just given all of the surrounding circumstances and the overwhelming evidence otherwise, they were just convinced of her involvement overall.
And so we know that no cameras were allowed inside the courtroom as the trial did go underway there for 5 different weeks. But as far as them actually broadcasting the verdict live stream so you could watch it anywhere, were you surprised about that?
No, not really. I think that the judge realized there was just an incredible amount of public intrigue on this case. I think it was a mistake, quite honestly, to not have had cameras in the courtroom from the very beginning, because people were watching this so closely, and not having the cameras didn't do much to stop that, but instead it may have created more kind of speculation as to what was taking place in court than you would have otherwise had with the transparency of cameras actually in the courtroom.
The big question here, what happens next for Lori Vallow Daybell?
Sure. So her sentencing isn't for a few months. That's how they do things in Idaho. They're going to prepare their sentencing memorandum for the court, which will include, evidence in mitigation, evidence in aggravation, talking about the seriousness of this case, maybe perhaps her background, things she may have experienced in her life that brought her to this moment. And then they're going to make their pitch before the judge. But I think in a case like this, where it was eligible for capital punishment, you do have her now being held responsible for 3 persons' deaths, including the heinous murder of both of her children. I doubt that we'll see anything less than life without parole.
And it does sound like after this is over, she then has to go over to Arizona and stand trial, I guess, on a different matter there.
Yeah, and my understanding is that in Arizona, the death penalty is still on the table. So the stakes are even higher for her in Arizona. So her troubles are not over, but it sounds like she's very deserving of what she's getting.
So we also have to think about the fact that Chad Daybell will go to trial as well. How does this guilty verdict here, several guilty verdicts, actually impact the case against Chad? Because we're talking 6 different counts that she was found guilty of very, very quickly there.
Yeah, I do not think it bodes well for him because a lot of the evidence that we saw in this trial is going to be the same exact evidence that we're going to see in his trial, maybe with a few small differences. But if anything, it will be stronger against him because I think the forensic evidence that can connect him to these murders is a little more direct. I mean, not the least of which that the bodies of the 2 children were found on his property. So that alone just shows more of a connection than we ever really saw with Lori Vallow in the actual murders themselves. So I think that his defense team has been following this case closely and is probably having a lot of sleepless nights until his trial.
Did you think that Lori Vallow would actually testify in the trial at all?
You know, the chance of a defendant testifying are so slim. It takes a special kind of personality. I think we saw that with Alex Murdaugh. He was kind of a narcissist, a person who thought he was smarter than the system. And I think that those factors did apply to Lori Vallow. I thought that if she truly was a believer in this kind of end of days cult that she believed in, that perhaps she thought this was her moment to testify before the entire world. But it sounds like her attorneys may have gotten to her and convinced her otherwise. I mean, again, I'm speculating. I don't know if those conversations even took place, but I wasn't surprised that she didn't testify, but I guess I would have said that I would not have been surprised if she did.
What do you think about the defense's argument there that Lori Vallow Daybell was actually influenced by Chad Daybell and thought that he was Jesus, so to speak? Was that a good argument on their behalf? Is that the only argument that they really had?
I think you're right. I think that might have been the only argument that they had, and I was actually surprised that you didn't see more of it. In their opening statements, the defense's opening statements, they kind of previewed that they would be pointing some of the fingers at Chad Daybell and even perhaps Alex Cox. But then as the case began to materialize, we never saw those defenses really start to show themselves, even during cross-examination. So I was surprised that it came back up again during their closing, and I thought that they would have leaned a little more heavily on that during the actual case, because to me that is her only real defense, is to point the finger at somebody else and say, I didn't have an involvement in this. I may have known about it afterwards, and that's a horrible thing the way I behaved, but that doesn't make me a murderer. But that's obviously not the argument they made, and it certainly perhaps would not have carried the day anyways.
And this was a case that so many people were paying such close attention to. Talking again about cameras in court, do you think not having cameras there during the trial made people kind of tune out because they couldn't watch it the way they were hoping to?
I think that you do see that effect happen. Obviously, the cases that have cameras in courtroom are going to attract a lot of attention. We saw that with Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. I mean, that was a civil case that a lot of people probably would not have paid that much attention to, even with the celebrities involved, had we not had cameras in court. And when we did, that became almost a cultural zeitgeist moment. And so I think this case had so much intrigue that people still did follow it. There was the release of the audio tapes after court each day, so there was a way to kind of have an understanding of what was taking place in the courtroom. But I imagine if you did have cameras in courtroom, it would have been an incredibly popular thing to have watched. Likely more of a media storm surrounding it than we already saw.
And not to kind of harp on the cameras in courtroom topic, but you and I have discussed this in the past. How does having cameras in court kind of change things for the way that the prosecution, the defense, really everyone in there acts in front of the camera?
Yeah, I don't think you can make the argument that people don't change their personalities and their behavior if they know that they're going to be on camera, especially something that might be televised nationally. I think it's important, though, because I think it's important for the public at large to know how our system works and to understand the integrity of it, and to be reassured of the integrity of it by seeing, how the sausage is made, as it were, when it comes to our criminal justice system. And to not have those cameras, I think, adds an air of mystery to it that it's undeserved. But you're right. I think that the prosecutors behave a little differently. I think the defense attorneys would behave a little differently. Everybody would be playing up to the cameras a bit. And most importantly, the jurors, they're affected by it. They know they're being watched. But I think you might not have seen much of a difference in a case like this where they already knew there was so much media attention, regardless of actually having cameras inside of the courtroom itself.
And this is a question that comes up time and time again, but when you do have a verdict that comes in so quickly, I mean, we're talking really under a day of deliberating, as you mentioned, does that automatically mean it is likely a guilty verdict?
That's kind of the tried and true theory behind all of it, is that if you have a jury that comes back quickly, that means that they've convinced themselves over the past few days or weeks of testimony that they know where they're coming out on top of things. When you see a jury that's taking time, that's when prosecutors begin to wring their hands a bit, because that means jurors are back there talking to themselves, and there might be some disagreement, and they might be having some trouble with some of the evidence, especially if they're asking questions or asking to have, exhibits brought back into the deliberation room, asking to have read back on certain testimony. It starts to give you an insight as to what they might be thinking. But a jury that comes back this quickly with zero questions, I think the only thing they asked for was pizza the night before. So that sounds like a jury that really had their minds made up.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Joshua Ritter, as always, thank you so much for taking the time here to join me. Is there anything else you want to add about the case before I let you go?
I think it's interesting that we do kind of have so much attention on a case like this, and we begin to wonder why that is. And I think it's the idea of something so horrible we can't really wrap our heads around. What would cause a mother to take the lives of her two children in such a heinous way? And I think a lot of people just still find it so unbelievable that we want to know the why. And I don't know if we were ever properly given an answer to that question as to why she committed something like this, if there is even an answer that would be satisfactory.
Very, very true. Thank you again for taking the time to help break this down for us.
Thank you.